The morning started like any other on the ranch. Quiet, except for the wind whispering through the cottonwoods and the hum of the old windmill spinning against a pale blue sky. I was pouring my first cup of coffee when I heard the sound of diesel engines growling up my gravel drive. 2 trucks, maybe 3. By the time I stepped out on the porch, the dust cloud they kicked up was already drifting toward the barn. At 71, my knees weren't as quick as they used to be, but my eyes were still sharp enough to make out the problem. 5 giant shipping containers, rust-red and dented, were being dropped across the only road that connected my house to the county road. The men unloading them wore reflective vests and smug expressions, like they'd done this 100 times before. I set my coffee down on the railing and muttered under my breath, "Not today." See, I've been through a lifetime of not todays. When my wife died, when the drought hit, when the bank nearly took the ranch my granddaddy built with his bare hands, every not today was a line I drew in the dirt, and I'd be damned if I let anyone else cross it. I limped down the porch steps, tugging the brim of my hat low. Morning. I called out to the man in charge. He was mid-40s, the type who smelled like new leather and entitlement, clipboard in hand. His vest read Lakeview Estates HOA enforcement. "Morning, sir," he said, barely glancing at me. "You can't park here anymore. Per order of the Homeowners Association, this driveway access is being restricted until fees and fines are settled." Fees and fines. I laughed dryly. "Son, I don't even live in your HOA." He smiled the way a wolf smiles before it bites. "Technically, Mr. McAllister, your property lies within our boundary. We've got records showing your driveway cuts through the community right-of-way. That means the HOA has jurisdiction." Jurisdiction? I stepped closer. "You might want to take another look at those records." "The man's name tag," said Craig. He flipped his clipboard open and tapped a page. "Already verified. You've been notified 6 times. Failure to comply results in enforcement action." I took a long look at those containers, now lined up end to end like a rusted wall. My pickup tractor and livestock feed trucks couldn't pass through even if I wanted to. They'd box me in on my own land. That was the day the HOA made their biggest mistake. Craig handed me a bright orange paper. "You'll need to pay the outstanding balance before we remove the containers. Until then, consider access suspended." I didn't say another word. I just nodded slowly and watched as they packed up and drove off, leaving me staring at the iron blockade like some kind of outlaw in his own country. The rest of the day passed in a quiet haze. The cattle still needed feeding. Fences needed checking, and the windmill needed fixing. But every time I walked past that wall of metal, my chest tightened. This land had seen my blood, my sweat, my family's bones under the earth, and now some clipboard cowboy thought he could fence me off from it? I sat on the porch as the sun went down, watching the light turn the containers into glowing red shadows. The coffee had gone cold, but I didn't move. I was thinking about ownership, about arrogance, about how easily men forget who really hold the ground beneath their feet. That night, I dug through my old filing cabinet in the office. Decades of papers, titles, leases, maps, tax records, all neatly stacked. When you've lived long enough to see banks fail and neighbors betray, you learn to keep proof of everything. I found what I was looking for, a folded map, yellow with age, showing the full boundaries of the ranch as it was purchased by my father in 1952. I traced the borders with my finger. The HOA line wasn't where Craig claimed it was. It was nearly a mile short. That community right-of-way they were talking about, it wasn't theirs at all. Then I found something better. The deed. Turns out, 50 years ago, my father had leased a large section of surrounding land that had been sold and resold over generations, eventually becoming the Lakeview Estate subdivision. But the lease had never been terminated. Legally, the land was still under McAllister Ranch Holdings. I smiled, slow and wide. By morning, I had a plan. The next day, I drove the long way around to the back pasture and came into town. My attorney, old friend named Geraldine Jerry Cook, had handled my family's paperwork for 30 years. She was the kind of woman who could slice a man's argument in half with one eyebrow raise. When I told her what happened, she leaned back and let out a sharp whistle. "They blocked your driveway?" "Oh, honey, They picked the wrong cowboy. I handed her the documents. I just need you to check something for me. That land they're building on, is it still under the old lease? She adjusted her glasses, squinting at the paper. You mean the McAllister Land Trust Lease of 1952? Let's see. Her eyes widened. Well, I'll be damned. It's still active. They never closed it. You technically own controlling rights to every parcel that sits on it, including the HOA headquarters. I chuckled. So if I'm reading that right, they're building, enforcing, and living on my land. Exactly. She grinned. You don't owe them a cent. In fact, they might owe you. We spent the next few hours drawing up notices and certified letters, one for each homeowner in the HOA. Not threats, just facts. A polite reminder that the ground under their million-dollar homes belonged to someone else, and that their HOA might want to have a little chat with their landlord before blocking any more driveways. By the time I left Jerry's office, I felt lighter than I had in years. The world outside looked sharper, the sun brighter. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't just surviving, I was standing my ground. When I pulled back into the ranch that evening, the containers were still there, blocking my drive like tombstones. But I didn't mind anymore. They weren't walls. They were warnings. I set a lawn chair out front, poured a glass of whiskey, and waited. Somewhere in town, Craig and his board members were opening envelopes that would turn their world upside down. As the stars came out, I thought about my father, how he'd taught me that ownership wasn't about titles or fences or papers. It was about stewardship, about respect. And when men forgot that, the land had a way of reminding them. I raised my glass toward the containers. To you, old man, I murmured. Looks like we're not done teaching lessons yet. The night wind carried the scent of sage and dust, and for the first time in months, I felt peace. The kind of peace that comes when you know the truth's on your side, and that truth is about to hit like a thunderclap. Tomorrow, the HOA would come calling, and when they did, they'd find out who really owned this land. By sunrise, the quiet of the ranch was broken by the sound of tires crunching gravel. 3 shiny black SUVs rolled up the containers like a parade of authority. Out stepped Craig, the clipboard general himself, flanked by 2 other HOA board members. They were dressed too clean for this kind of dirt, shoes polished like they'd never seen cow manure before. I was already waiting for them, coffee in hand, leaning against the fence as the morning light cut across the valley. The air was crisp and cool, the kind that wakes every bone in your body. Craig spotted me and walked over with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. Mr. McAllister, he said, I assume you received our notice about the fines. Blocking access was a necessary measure. You'll find that we... Stop right there. I interrupted, slow and steady. Before you start quoting your rule book, you might want to check your mail. Should have got something from my attorney this morning. He frowned. Attorney? What attorney? Jerry Cook, I said, taking a long sip of coffee. Been handling McAllister Ranch affairs for 3 decades. She sent each of you certified letters. Might want to take a seat before you open them. His face twitched, but he kept up the act. Look, sir, I don't think you understand how HOA law works. You're a part of this community, whether you like it or not. There are standards to maintain, rules to follow. I couldn't help but chuckle. Oh, I understand rules just fine. I've been living by them longer than you've been alive. But the thing about rules is, they don't mean much if you're standing on the wrong ground. Behind him, one of the other board members, a woman with a nervous twitch in her smile, whispered something to him and handed over her phone. Craig's expression changed. His confidence faltered for the first time that morning. I could see it hit him like a falling hammer. Whatever Jerry sent him was making its rounds fast. He stepped back and adjusted his tie. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, McAllister, but if you think you can intimidate the HOA... Game. I cut him off, voice calm but firm. You blocked a 71-year-old man's only driveway with 5 shipping containers. You left me without access to my property. You think that's a game? His words caught in his throat. The other board members avoided my eyes. I walked toward the containers, ran my hand along the cold metal. See this? I said, this wall you built, it's not just blocking a road. It's blocking respect. And son, when you forget respect, you've already lost. Just then, another truck came rumbling up the road, dust flying behind it. It was Jerry. She stepped out, sharp as ever, waving a folder in one hand. "Morning, gentlemen," she said cheerfully, though there was steel in her tone. "I see you met my client." Craig blinked, unsure whether to speak or salute. "Ma'am, who exactly are you?" "Geraldine Cook, attorney at law. I represent the McAllister Land Trust, the rightful leaseholder and legal controlling entity of the property your HOA sits on." The silence that followed was so heavy it could have dropped an ox. Craig stammered. That can't be right. This neighborhood was developed 30 years ago. We have titles." "Yes," Jerry replied smoothly. "Titles built on leased land. The original lease was never closed or transferred, which means, technically, you've been subletting from McAllister's for half a century. That gives my client authority over what happens here, including your enforcement activities." I couldn't resist. "So, Craig," I said, "how's it feel to block your landlord's driveway?" The two board members looked ready to faint. One of them whispered, "Oh my God, we've been sending him fines." Jerry opened her folder and pulled out a document. "As of this morning, we've filed a notice of intent to review the land lease agreement. That means all HOA actions are suspended pending legal clarification. In the meantime, you're ordered to remove these containers immediately." Craig turned red. "You can't just—" "Oh, we can," she said, smiling faintly. "And we will." They didn't argue much after that. Within the hour, the trucks were back. The men who had so proudly dropped those containers were now sweating under the sun, hauling them away while I watched from the porch with another cup of coffee. The sound of metal scraping and engines revving was the sweetest music I'd heard in years. But the real satisfaction was revenge. It was justice. A quiet kind. The kind you earn by outlasting pride. When they were done, Craig walked over, looking like he'd aged 10 years in a day. "Mr. McAllister," he said, voice low, "we may have made an error. I'd like to personally apologize on behalf of the HOA board." I nodded. "You're not the first man to mistake land for power. You just learned faster than most." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "We didn't mean to cause you harm. We thought we were just enforcing rules." "That's the trouble with too many rules," I said. "They make folks forget to use their hearts." For a while, we stood in silence, watching the last container being loaded onto the truck. Dust hung in the air like memory. Then Craig looked at me, eyes tired but honest. "What happens now?" I shrugged. "That depends on you. You can keep fighting to control what isn't yours, or you can start learning how to be part of something bigger. This land don't need more bosses. It needs caretakers." He nodded slowly. "Maybe you're right." "I usually am," I said with a faint grin. "Go on now. You got some neighbors to talk to. They'll want to know who they really pay rent to." He gave a weak chuckle, shook his head, and walked back to his SUV. After they left, Jerry turned to me with a smirk. "Well, I'd say that's one for books. You just taught a whole HOA a crash course in humility." I smiled faintly. "Maybe they'll remember it longer than the last drought." She laughed. "So, what do you plan to do now? You could technically charge rent, you know?" I looked out over the pasture. The morning light had turned the hills gold, the kind of glow that makes you feel small and blessed all at once. "Nah," I said softly. "I'm not looking to take. I just wanted them to understand something." "And what's that?" "That this land doesn't belong to anyone. Not really. We just get to borrow it for a while. How we treat it and each other decides what kind of mark we leave behind." She nodded. "You always were a stubborn romantic. Just a realist who's seen too much foolishness," I said, smiling. "Now come on. You want coffee?" We sat on the porch for a long while after that, listening to the wind move through the sagebrush. The containers were gone, but the mark they'd left, the lesson, they'd stay a while. By evening, I started getting calls. Not from the HOA board, but from individual homeowners. Some wanted to apologize. Some wanted to understand. A few even asked if they could come by and talk. I said yes to all of them. The first was a young couple who'd moved in 2 years ago. They brought cookies, nervous smiles on their faces. "We're so sorry," the wife said. "We had no idea what was happening. We thought the HOA was protecting the community." I smiled kindly. That's what they thought too. The trick is remembering that communities aren't protected by rules. They're protected by people. The husband nodded thoughtfully. "If it's all right with you, we'd like to help fix the fence line along the west pasture. Herd's been falling in places." "All right," I said, "bring gloves. I'll have the tools ready." And that was how it began, a slow healing between neighbors who had once seen themselves as divided by paper, not united by place. Over the next few days, I watched something shift. Folks started coming by, offering help, asking questions, wanted to learn. The HOA meetings turned from power plays into community discussions. Even Craig showed up one afternoon in jeans and work boots, helping clear debris from the creek bed. He didn't say much, but his presence said enough. Sometimes justice isn't about winning. It's about showing people a better way to stand. That night, I sat under the stars again, the kind of sky so wide it makes you feel close to heaven. The containers were gone, but I could still see their ghost outlines in the dirt. I didn't hate them anymore. They were part of the story now, a reminder that arrogance can build walls, but humility tears them down. And somewhere deep inside, I felt my father's pride. Maybe I hadn't just defended the land. Maybe I'd kept its spirit alive. Tomorrow, I'd invite the HOA board back. Not for confrontation this time, but for a talk about stewardship, shared wells, and maybe even a community barbecue. Because the older I get, the more I've learned. The only walls worth building are the ones that keep storms out, not neighbors point 3 weeks past. The containers were gone, but their shadow lingered. You could still see the faint impressions of where they'd stood. 5 long scars in the gravel, marking a time when pride had outweighed reason. But the land heals, and so do people, if you give them time and truth. The Lakeview Estates community had changed since that morning. The HOA board no longer held their meetings behind closed doors. They invited me to sit in, sometimes just to listen, sometimes to share what I knew about the land. For the first time in a long time, there was laughter in those rooms. Real laughter, not the kind people use to hide nerves. Craig came by the ranch more often than I'd expected. He brought his son one Saturday, a lanky teenager who spent most of the time pretending not to listen while I taught him how to mend a wire fence. Craig didn't talk about the lawsuit or the embarrassment that followed. He didn't have to. The fact that he was here, hands dirty and boots in the mud, said everything that needed saying. One afternoon, as the sun dipped behind a distant ridge, he stood beside me, wiping sweat from his brow. "Never thought I'd be spending my weekend fixing fences on a ranch," he said with a grin. "Good way to learn humility," I replied. "Fences don't care about your title or paycheck. They only stand to the hands that build them." He nodded, quiet for a long while. Then he said, "I was raised in the city. My dad worked in real estate. Taught me to see land as numbers and property lines. But this," he gestured around at the hills, the cattle, the windmills spinning lazily in the distance. "This feels different." "It is different," I said softly. "You don't own this land. You belong to it." That's a truth most men forget until it's too late. That seemed to stick with him. He didn't reply right away, but I could tell he was turning it over in his head, like a stone in his pocket. Later that evening, as the neighbors gathered for what had somehow become our weekly community dinner, I stood back and watched. Long tables set up near the barn, strings of lights glowing against the darkening sky. Kids ran around with dogs, women swapped pie recipes, and old men argued about weather and football. It was simple, but it was real. The same people who'd once voted to fine me for having a broken fence were now helping me repair it. And the man who blocked my driveway with shipping containers was grilling ribs and laughing with the folks whose mailboxes he used to patrol. That night, I didn't feel like a landlord. I felt like a neighbor again. When dinner was nearly done, Jerry stood up with her glass raised. "To second chances," she said with a smile. "And to folks who remind us that doing what's right isn't about who's got the loudest voice. It's about who's got the longest roots." The crowd cheered, and for a moment my eyes stung a little. Maybe it was the smoke from the fire pit. Maybe not. Craig came over afterward, still smiling. "You know," he said, "you could have taken us all to court. You would have won, too." I shrugged. "Maybe, but I wasn't looking to win. I was looking to teach. My daddy used to say, if you win without teaching, you lose the next generation." He nodded slowly. "You've got a way of making things simple." "Life is simple," I said. "People make it complicated." He laughed at that and shook my hand. A real handshake. Firm, honest. "Thank you, Mr. McAllister, for everything." "Call me Sam," I said. "You earned it." Over the next few weeks, life on the ranch settled back into rhythm. The cattle needed tending. The fences needed mending, and the windmill, well, that old thing always needed fixing. But I noticed something else, too. The folks from Lakeview Estates started dropping by more often. Not to complain, to help. A retired teacher brought over some old photos of the land from when she first moved here. A young family helped me paint the barn. Even the HOA treasurer, a quiet woman named Judith, came by to plant wildflowers along the road where containers had once stood. It was strange how something that started in conflict had bloomed into community, like wildflowers growing from a burn scar. One morning, I was walking property line when I found Craig standing by the edge of the pasture, staring down at a small wooden stake in the dirt. It marked where the HOA boundary used to be drawn. He kicked at the dirt thoughtfully. "You ever go to move these markers?" he asked. I smiled. "Nope. They're a reminder." "Of what?" "That men can draw all the lines they want," I said. "But the land don't care. It'll outlast every one of us. So we might as well find ways to share it while we're here." He was quiet for a moment. "You ever think about selling this place?" I looked out over the hills, the same hills my father had walked, my wife had painted, my children had played on. "No," I said, "this land's not for sale, but it's always for sharing." He smiled, and for once it wasn't the smile of a man trying to negotiate. It was the smile of a man who finally understood. That evening, as the sky turned to fire and the world went gold, I sat on the porch again. The breeze was soft, the crickets loud. I thought about all the years behind me, the struggles, the droughts, the loneliness, and I thought about this new chapter. Maybe this was what my wife, Maggie, meant when she said, "The good Lord doesn't give us land to fight over. He gives it so we'll have something worth standing together for." The memory of her voice drifted through me like wind through the grass. I closed my eyes and smiled. Somewhere out there, the HOA board was drafting a new kind of rule book, one built not on punishment, but participation. They were turning the community center into a shared workshop for local farmers and kids to learn about soil conservation and stewardship. They'd even asked if I'd teach the first class. When I showed up that Saturday, the room was packed. City folks in clean shirts, kids with dirt already on their knees. I stood at the front, nervous in a way I hadn't felt in years. "All right," I said, clearing my throat. "I'm not much of a teacher, but I can tell you this. Land doesn't belong to us. It's a loan from the future. How we treat it decides what kind of people we are. The best thing you can do for the ground under your feet is to respect it and the folks standing on it with you." A young boy in the front row raised his hand. "Is that why you didn't sue the HOA?" I smiled. "That's exactly why, son. Because winning a fight don't mean much if you lose your neighbors doing it." The room went quiet for a long moment. Then, one by one, people started nodding. That's when I realized something. The fight hadn't been about land at all. It had been about connection, about pride, humility, and remembering what really matters when the dust settles. Afterward, as I drove home through the winding dirt road, I saw the wildflowers blooming where those containers once stood, purple and yellow against the dry red soil. Nature's way of saying, "I forgive you." I parked by the barn, got out, and let the quiet settle around me. The air smelled like sage and rain, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled softly, promising change. I thought about how strange life is, how the things meant to bury us sometimes become the very things that grow us. How a man can go from being fenced into freeing others, just by standing his ground with patience instead of fury. That night, Before turning in, I wrote a single line in my old leather journal.